Welcome to the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology, Day 7. We've spent the last 6 days hearing about an Irish king called Bran, son of Fíval, who went on a magical voyage to the otherworld. Starting today, we're going to hear about a Welsh king called Bran, son of Llŷr, who did something similar. His story is told in the second branch of the Mabinogi. But before we start that, remember this back on day 2 when I said this? The two translations I've been working with are by James Carney and John Carey. And with their similar surnames, it's easy to confuse them. But of course, you wouldn't do that. Because now, honestly, I'm wondering whether it's even safe to let you loose on all these Welsh names we're about to tackle. So let's meet our new Bran. Bendigeidfran, that is, Bran the Blessed, son of Llŷr, was the crowned king of the island of Britain. Bran. Did I mention that Bran was a giant? It's important that you should know that. He was exalted with a crown of London, but this story begins at Harlech, overlooking Cardigan Bay in North Wales. Bran was sitting with his brother, Manawydan, son of Llŷr, who was not a giant, as far as we know. They were surrounded by the nobles of Bran's court, including his two half-brothers, Nisien and Evnisien. These brothers were the sons of Eroswydd, the second husband of their mother, Penardhin, who was herself the daughter of Beli-Mawr. Of these half-brothers, I can tell you that Nisien was a peacemaker, but Evnisien was a troublemaker who could stir up strife between the best of friends. As they sat looking out to sea, they saw 13 ships sailing from the south of Ireland. They were making good headway in a stiff breeze and obviously making for Harlech. Bran considered this bold action and wondered what it could mean. As he had received no message to expect anyone, he ordered his men to arm themselves and meet the ships to find out the reason for coming, while he watched from the rock above the bay. When the men got down to the harbor, they were amazed at the quality of the ships which were coming in. They were beautifully made and flew banners of brocaded silk. One of the ships pulled ahead of the others and made a sign of peace, and they began to take their rowing boats and come ashore. They shouted up greetings to Bran up there on his rock. "You are welcome," Bran returned. "But who are you, and why have you come? Whose ships are these?" "Lord, it is Matholwch, King of Ireland, who has come. These are his ships." "What does your lord want?" asked Bran. "Will he come to land?" "He has come with a petition, my lord. He will not land unless you will satisfy his request." "What is his request?" Bran asked. "He wishes to become your ally by marrying your sister, even Branwen, daughter of Llŷr," they said. "This would join your families and make both islands stronger." "Well, then let him come ashore," said Bran. "We will take counsel with him." So the message was relayed to Matholwch, and he came ashore. Bran's people greeted their guests with the best hospitality and friendship. There was feasting and celebration among the crowd that had gathered that evening. In the morning, a council was held, and it was decided to give Branwen to Matholwch. She was one of the 3 chief ladies of Britain, and the most beautiful. The wedding feast would be at Aberfraw, so everyone set out, with Bran's people going by land and Matholwch's retinue by ship. The wedding feast began with Manawydan sitting beside Bran on one side and Branwen and Matholwch on the other. But don't imagine them in a castle. No, they were in a tall, beautiful pavilion, for Bran was so tall that no house or castle could contain him. They feasted and caroused until late, and then Matholwch bedded Branwen, thus sealing their marriage. The next day was spent in finding places for all of Matholwch's men and horses, which were very numerous and had to be billeted around the countryside. A few days later, Evnisien appeared, apparently knowing nothing about Matholwch and the wedding. He began to ask where all these horses had come from. Why, they're the horses of Matholwch, King of Ireland, they told him, and he demanded to know what was going on. Matholwch's married your sister Branwen. The wedding feast is still underway, they told him. True to form, Evnissyan flew into a rage. How dare they do this without my consent? This is the greatest insult they could have given me. And with that, he started slashing at the horses with his blade. He sliced their lips back to their teeth and their ears to their heads. He cut their tails off up to their backs, and if he was able to grab a hold of their eyelids, he cut them back to the bone also. Throughout the countryside, he ravaged and mutilated Matholwch's beautiful horses to the extent that they were rendered useless. Do you know, I've never told this story before. That was a tough bit of storytelling. It's also worthy of discussion, but we're not going to do that right now. The Irish stories we've been looking at actually had very few names in them, didn't they? So we didn't have a lot of concern about keeping them straight or how to pronounce them. And I hope you appreciated me putting all the names on the screen today as I was telling the story, and that it wasn't a distraction. A lot of Celtic stories begin by introducing the characters and reminding us of their genealogies. So-and-so, son of such and such, son of what's his name. I sometimes wonder whether that opening wall of names is what discourages a lot of people and causes them to just give up. But we need to know who the people in this story are. And there are some interesting questions that I want to look at about the names of our main characters. So I want to start with the name Bran. In both Welsh and Irish, the name refers to a crow or a raven. In Irish, it's mostly used for ravens, but not always. In Welsh, it's used for crows a lot and also for ravens. I really wouldn't get too pedantic about this, like I see some people insisting one meaning only in one language. For one thing, an awful lot of people just don't know the difference between a crow and a raven. And it was no different in medieval times, I'm sure. Certain people would know, but an awful lot of people wouldn't. Throughout history, in most languages, the words used to describe different kinds of birds, it isn't very scientific. Looking at historical dictionaries can be a good way to understand the meanings of names. Older Celtic language names are usually descriptive, not just the names of deities, but the names of just people too. Males might be given nicknames relating to an event in early life that might stick with them through their life, or it might be to do with their personal appearance. They often use the names of animals, which are thought of as fierce, to suggest bravery and so on. So this is a good resource for historical Irish. I'm sorry the type is rather small by the time I fit it all on the screen. But I think you can see that most of the references are to ravens. Raven, right at the beginning, first word, and associated with battle and slaughter and carnage. Raven, raven, raven-like, but also crows, at least one reference, and vultures. So, like I said, people aren't always very exact with bird names. So this is the historical dictionary for Welsh. Notice that in Welsh, Bran has a tobach, a little house, a wee roof over the A, so that you say the A longer, Bran, rather than the short Bran of the Irish. In Welsh, it seems to be a generic word for all three of our large black corvids. It's likely that this word comes originally from the sounds crows and ravens make, just like crow in English does. So here we can see rook, raven, and crow all potentially being called Bran, although some of them also have other names, because that's also really common with birds. So you'd think that the name Branwen is simple. Wen means white or fair, so white crow, right? And while it can mean that, it has a bunch of other meanings. Because white crows are rare, Branwen is used for things you seldom see, but it can also mean a bird that tells you a secret. In English, we say, a little bird told me, right? And if you're familiar with Branwen's trained messenger bird, which we'll soon be hearing about, this is an interesting connection. But people probably didn't say it yet back when our story was written down. And finally, it's also a name for this beloved little British butterfly called in English the cabbage white butterfly. So Branwen can mean a lot of things. But notice that it's two words, Branwen, in all these uses, even though they represent a single idea. There's really no evidence for Branwen as a woman's name in Wales until recently. Bronwen, yes, that means white breast, but not Branwen. In fact, the great Welsh scholar, Rachel Bromwich, had a theory that the name was inspired by a mixture of creating a female name out of her brother's name, Bran, and the name of a Saxon princess who had a similar story. The name Branwen is probably to be explained as an adaptation of Bronwen, white breast, in which the vowel, the A or O, has been influenced by the name of her brother Bran. It may be pointed out that there is a curious similarity both in the names and in the stories of Ronwen, that's our Saxon princess, and Bronwen, i.e. Branwen, in that both heroines were bestowed in marriage upon the king of a foreign country as a pledge for a political alliance which subsequently fell apart. And both names are applied uniquely to the heroines concerned and no other. So there's no other Ronwens in Saxon stories, and there's no other Branwen in Welsh stories. Some neo-pagans seem to be a bit obsessed with ravens, maybe just a bit. And I'm just sounding a note of caution here, that Branwen might not necessarily be any kind of crow or raven goddess originally. But then again, she might. So Gwilym Morris Baird had a quite elaborate theory about an overarching bird theme in Welsh mythology. It's his theory, and I don't feel like it's really mine to teach at this point, but I want to offer you at least one scholarly counter-argument, so I'll just give you a taste of it. In his book, Taliesin Origins, Gwyl devotes several pages to this, and here he's comparing events in the second branch to those in the fourth branch. So if you're not familiar with the fourth branch, I do apologize. So he says, the first similarity is that of Lle and Bendigeidfran themselves. Both have identities connected to birds. In the fourth branch, Lle's fate is entwined with that of a little wren. At the very moment of his death, Lle transforms into a wounded eagle. So he's saying at the symbolic beginning and end of Lle's life, we find birds. So the wren turns up when Lle is getting his adult name. Likewise, Bendigeidfran's identity seems to be bound to crows. His name means blessed crow. Bendigeid plus Bran gives us Bendigeidfran. His fate is also determined by the actions of his sister Branwen, whose name is the feminine version of his own. Bran plus Gwen equals crow, white or blessed. She makes her desperate plea for rescue through a starling, an act that brings about her brother's death. So I'm probably not going to do a great job of making a case for this theory, but it's very much built on these and other bird identities. So of course the whole theory falls if the bird identities turn out to be weak. So you'll need to read his book and decide for yourself. We've dealt with Bran and Branwen's names and identities. The other question surrounds Manawydan. So there's obviously some kind of relationship between Manannán, son of Llair, and Manawydan, son of Llyr. This looks like it should be easy, but the discussion about it is actually a little complicated. But here he is again in a story with a guy called Bran, who's about to go on a voyage. This time he's Bran's brother, so it's not like for like. In the 10th century, an Irish bishop called Cormac made a dictionary, and this is his entry about Manannán mac Lir, or part of it. Manannán mac Lir, a famous merchant who dwelt in the Isle of Man. He is the pilot who was best at sea, so the ship's pilot, in the west of the world. He used to know by studying the heavens, that is by looking at the sky, the time that would be fine weather and foul weather, and when each would change. Hence the Irish and Britons called him God of the Sea, and hence they said that he was Macaleer, son of the sea, and from Manannan's name the Isle of Man has been called. So he's quite correctly connecting Manannan to the Isle of Man. He's still strongly connected to the Isle of Man to this day, and I'll share a video at the end which goes into that a bit more. Cormac is saying that the Isle of Man is named after Manannan. Moving from the 10th century to the 21st, Patrick Sims Williams, a really brilliant Celtic scholar, says that Manannan takes his name from the island. And I think that's the consensus now. So he says the Irish name Manannan is based on the Gaelic name of the Isle of Man. The formation of Manannan by means of the suffix on is straightforward. Its original meaning may have been Isle of Man born, or having the nature of the Isle of Man. In other words, that ending is associating him with the Isle of Man. Manawyddan, on the other hand, is not a straight derivative of Manaw. He's going to tell you what Manaw is, don't worry. Thus, it is simpler to regard Manawyddan as a Welsh adaptation of the Irish name, altered so as to connect it clearly with Manaw, the Welsh equivalent of the Irish Mannan. So Manaw is the Welsh name for the Isle of Man. In modern Irish, it's Mannan. That the form is Manawyddan rather than something like Manawan may be due to contamination with the word Manawyd or Manawyd, which means an awl, you know, the leather working tool, the thing you poke holes in leather with. So Manawyddan's name came to be associated with this word, giving rise to his role of shoemaker in the four branches of the Mabinogi and the Triads. However, there's kind of a third way, and I suspect it's the correct one. So here's Rachel Bromwich again, not really disagreeing with Sims Williams, but I think giving us some insight into what's going on. The exact nature of the relation between Manannan Maclear and Manawyddan Vabthlir is difficult to ascertain. Yeah, I think we're finding that out. The most acceptable explanation is perhaps that offered by Vindish, who claimed that both Irish and Welsh forms were derived independently from the place name. Welsh Manaw, Irish Mana, Manu. If this explanation is correct, then Manawyddan Manannan can be regarded as a deity known from early times to both branches of the Celtic people. And this seems on the whole more probable than the alternative explanation, which is sometimes advocated, that the imperfect phonetic correspondence, remember Patrick Sims Williams was saying it would be something more like Manawan or something if it was just changed from the Irish. So that the imperfect phonetic correspondence between the two names is to be accounted for as due to a learned borrowing from one country to another. So the takeaway from this is he can be regarded as a deity known from early times to both branches of Celtic people. I think if you really look at all the evidence about Manannan and Manawyddan, and the body of evidence about Manannan is enormous. If you look at medieval texts, folklore, place names, local customs, I think this has to be correct. I'm really interested in Manannan and Manawyddan, so we'll be coming back to this in the coming days. And we'll also be looking at how Bran and his voyages and the relationship to Manannan kind of fits into the picture. And if you're a real Manannan, Manawyddan fan, then you might like to take my course about him, which happens in the summertime. So we'll finish today with a quick look at a couple of maps, just so that we know where we are. So this is North Wales, this is the Llyn Peninsula, and this is Anglesey. This map doesn't really show. Anglesey is sort of just an island, just barely. There's water there, but it doesn't show up very well. Harlech is here overlooking Cardigan Bay, and this is modern day Harlech Castle. And you can see how it's up on a height. We were hearing in the story about Bran up on his height. And so he's up on this height, looking down at the harbor, talking down to the Irish people as they arrive. The other red pin there is Aberfrau, up here in Anglesey, where they go for the wedding. This is still Harlech, the red pin, but you can see now how the Isle of Man is really nestled in between Wales and Scotland, and so that's Scotland up there, that's England there. It's really nestled in between all these countries. So if they were coming from the south of Ireland, maybe Matholwch's men were coming from down here somewhere, Waterford or Cork, who knows, coming up here into Cardigan Bay. But we can see how the Isle of Man, if Manannán, as I think, is the indigenous deity of the Isle of Man, then we can see how everybody would have been visiting the Isle of Man, stopping off there, trading, whatever, getting water, whatever they needed to do as they made their way between these other points. So they would have all got to hear about Manannán. Tomorrow we'll have to deal with the aftermath of the awful business of the horses and find out how poor Matholwch reacts when he finds out. I'll see you later.